Hello, I'm Lucy from Bookshanks and I'm here today with my next review from the Women's Prize for Fiction Longlist 2022. If you're reading along with them or you're reading any of them, I'd love to have a chat with you in the comments. So please do stick around, subscribe and say hello. So, first book I read was Careless by Kirsty and that was a good one. Second one I've read is Build Your House Around My Body by Violet Kupersmith, who knows? Who cares? It's a good one. It's another good one. And do you know what? It's really hard, isn't it, literary prizes, because you throw all these different books into a pot and how could you possibly compare them when we've got two books like this, and these are the first two I've read, that are absolute chalk and cheese. They are so far apart in just absolutely every way, shape or form, but both really brilliant reads. So this one is the story of two missing women in Vietnam. One in around 1965-ish, I think, and one in the present day. But it's not a mystery story. It's not a crime story. It is a ghost story. Borderline at times a horror story. And it is also a completely and utterly, totally bonkers story. It is such, I mean, it's just a riot from start to finish, completely out of this world. And the back actually describes it as a fever dream of a book, which before I had read it and I read the back, I was like, what on earth does that mean? But actually it is such a good description. I've also seen it described as kaleidoscopic. And that is a good description too. And I'll get onto a little bit more about that later. But generally, you know, it stretches your brain. And the plot itself actually stretches your brain too, because we jump between time, both between like that period of 1965-ish and the present, but also we jump way back in time to sort of like French colonial period, turn of the century, the Second World War. We've got all these little other bits of time scattered throughout. So you've got to get your head around like when you are reading. You've got to get your head around who you are reading as well, because we've got so many different perspectives in there, from the missing women to all their family members, to a dog. Actually a dog, the dog is a delight, love the dog, but you've got to know when you are talking about, you've got to know who you're talking about. There's really complicated links between all these characters and all these time periods, so you've got to hold all of those in your head, and it is a lot to take on board. Actually, at the start of the book, there's a map, and I always say I love a book that starts with a map, but there's also a cast list, and generally I say I don't love a book that starts with a cast list, because you know instantly it's going to be super complicated. But actually, I didn't mind it in this one because, you know, there was enough entertaining that carried me through. Although I did go back and check that cast list often. What else is there in terms of the plot? I mean, I don't want to give anything away, but yeah, ghost story. We've got people, well, I guess the ghosts kind of take, well, definitely one form, debatably two forms. The first ghost is like a smoke that is formed of people's memories, I think, basically. I reckon, you know, it's open to interpretation, deliberately so, but I'm going to say this smoke is formed of people's memories. It's a malevolent smoke. It's not a good smoke. It inhabits people. It means that they can dislodge their bottom jaw all the way down to their waist. I mean, it's bonkers. I don't even know how to describe this. And the second ghost, kind of, is like a two-headed snake that keeps appearing. Is it a ghost? Maybe it's a metaphor instead. We can get onto that later, but that is my strange description of the really strange plot. The setting, yeah, touched on that, haven't we? Vietnam. A really recognisable Vietnam to me, because I've travelled there quite a lot, and so the sort of like modern day setting I thought was really well observed, and it's interesting to take in through the different eyes of the people who live there. And we've got like a whole spectrum from like local people to Vietnamese Americans, so sort of like that 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out the door, to like expats and backpacker community. We've got like this whole spectrum, and again, the dog. So the setting, I liked that a lot. It's really vivid. There's a lot of description. It's a very descriptive book. But yeah, that was fine. That worked for me. The main character, if I think you can pick a main character, is Winnie. And she is the Vietnamese American woman who is coming to Vietnam to live, to teach English, I think for the first time in her life, as a young adult. And she is the second woman to go missing. Now she is lonely, very lonely, a bit lost, but making herself almost deliberately more lonely. She is out to self-destruct in a really entertaining way. And she knows she is. She is wildly reckless, and she's almost given up on life. She is like on the verge of being beaten, but she's just got just enough curiosity left in her that propels her into doing these just wonderfully entertaining, reckless things. The one flaw that I think Winnie has is that we don't know anything really about her life before she came to Vietnam. So often, you know, or like almost always in books, you know, like the main protagonist, the sort of the main character that it's about, you have their motivation set up like at the start of the book, so you know where you're working and you know what's driving them forward. And we don't really know anything about Winnie's past. So it's quite hard to get a handle on what is motivating her or what's brought her to this place of like extreme bleakness. Like there are jokes, other characters' jokes, you know, that she's come to Vietnam to find herself, but she hasn't really. She's come to like really try and lose herself, but we don't know why. The end of the book kind of hints at it a little bit, but I did feel that she was just a bit incomplete because yeah, we don't have that sort of like that backstory, and it doesn't need to be in depth, but I needed to know a little bit more about what made her tick. I mean, I'm not going to talk about all the other characters around her because I mean there are so many, and their paths cross in really interesting ways. I mean, you know, you could argue in lots of coincidental ways, and you know there are a lot of coincidences in this book that, you know, that are key to the plot as well, but because of that like magical ghostly element, you kind of can believe that they're fate rather than coincidences for the purpose of the author getting to do what she wants to do. Does that make sense? Like, I was okay with the coincidences, you know, and a couple of them I didn't see coming, and when they were revealed I was like, oh well, that is so obvious, why did I miss that? But I missed it because I was so wrapped up in the utter chaos going on around me, and I really feel like I'm not communicating the chaos. I just keep saying it's chaos, but it's good chaos. It is, trust me, it's good chaos. So the style in which it's written is I mean, it's pretty literary, so the language is quite flowery, it's enjoying itself, you know, it's quite conscious of what it's doing, it's very descriptive. They're not brief, curt descriptions, you know, they have got a little bit of a flourish to them. But to me, that brought it to life. I was okay with that. It's like borderline too much in places, but generally I was like, no. And they're astute observations, I think, particularly about people, that I really enjoyed, and the descriptions of people and how, I guess, Winnie assesses everyone around her, like the expats and the backpackers, you know, and the Vietnamese people that she's trying to teach English, and all these little observations around her that I thought were bang on and I really loved, and that made, I think, the lengthy descriptions fine for me. The other thing that stood out, like style-wise, about this book for me, and I probably should have said it up front, is it is so funny. It is like laugh out loud funny in places. Really dark black humour, which like lends itself to that fever dream kind of vibe. But also the way in which people speak to each other is so on the nose. It's so blunt and direct. And do you know what? When I reviewed Careless, I said that nobody ever said what they were thinking. They think all these thoughts and then they say something completely different. Whereas in this book, nobody has any filter whatsoever. Like, they literally just spout out of their mouths whatever comes into their heads. And it's wonderful. It's such a joy. Like, it's so funny. I really, really liked like the humour, particularly in the dialogue that just ran throughout this book. In terms of the themes that are addressed, so I think the big one that's being addressed is violence in lots of different forms, particularly sexual violence against women, but also, and I talk about that like explicitly sexual violence, like big acts of sexual violence. And it is a dark book, and you know it sort of is trying to make you uncomfortable in lots of places, but also like all these micro aggressions, like these small acts of violence that you wouldn't even notice, or you know, that just make you sort of twitch and become normalized, like the small acts of sexual violence that are like omnipresent, I think, for so many people. But also other types of violence as well. So the book does look at like colonial violence, you know, going back to the French occupation. It looks at war in general, and like all the sort of like trickle down effects of, you've got this big violence of colonialism, you've got this big violence of war, but you've got all these little bits of violence trickling down, I guess, in loads of different forms. And I think you can push that further as well and be like, okay, well, actually one of the themes also is about reclaiming control, like victims of violence finding ways to reclaim control over their own bodies, over their own autonomy, like their direction, the things that they do, again, both at like a large scale, you know, in the big life choices that they make, but also like on individual scale senses, like the sort of like, again, those everyday actions that people take to like reclaim control. And I think, you know, you can push that even further and be like, is it revenge? You know, you can look at revenge being a theme, I guess, as well as revenge kind of being part of the plot, the ghost story plotty bit. The other theme that I think is touched upon here, this is going to be a really long review, but it's a good book, it's worth it. The other thing that I think is touched upon is like a clash of cultures, like past versus present. So obviously we've got the previous woman going missing, the girl going missing, and we've got Winnie going missing, and how those things are linked. But there is this double-headed snake that keeps appearing, which I think is like a metaphor for like the past and the present, like how they cross over. Again, I think you could interpret these things in loads of different ways because it is so utterly barking, but that's how I took the snake. I'm thinking it's like, yeah, it's like past and present kind of melding together. And also I think because there are so many instances in this book where you're like, is this reality, or is this, you know, a dream, or is this magic? Is this a ghost? Like the two-headed snake is kind of blurring those lines, I think, a little bit between what is reality and what is magic, or something more sinister. And that is Build Your House Around My Body. I mean, I try to end these reviews by saying it's a bit like this, but don't know what it's like. I don't know. Haven't got a clue. Haven't got a clue. If you've read it, what's it like? What did you think? I would really love to know. And the bottom line is, actually, I loved it. It was so much fun. It was just so much fun. You know, when they ask you, like, you know, who would you like to go to dinner with? You know, which author, living or dead, would you like to have dinner with? I want to have dinner with Violet because I think she would be really fun. She would be a good night out, because it's just like so very many levels of imagination. That's what it is. It is like an amazing feat of imagination, which, you know, whilst I don't think it's completely without issues, my big one probably being like Winnie being a bit incomplete. She needs a bit more of that backstory to understand those motivations. Ultimately, can't remember what my point was. How did this sentence start? It's just great. It's really fun. It's really fun. Totally deserves its place on the list. Oh, do you know what? Such a good reading streak. I hope that you are having a good reading streak too. And thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye.